Shadow of the Erdtree is an expansion with many fascinating story threads and elements. There is the story of the Horn Scent of Tower Settlement, there is Marika's beginnings in the village of the Shamans, and of course, the story all culminates with a final showdown against Miquella the Kind and his lord consort. However, the poster child for the DLC was Messmer, the long-hidden demigod child of Marika, who once led a brutal crusade against the Horn Scent. In terms of story, Messmer's crusade is almost the backdrop, the background lore that frames Miquella's main story in the expansion. Despite that, Messmer's crusade and story remains one of the most lore-rich in the entire expansion. Additionally, Messmer's own story is a lens through which we can learn more about Marika, the royal family, and the politics of Leyndell and Erdtree rule. Additionally, it introduces the Abyssal Serpent, opening up an entirely new discussion surrounding light and dark within the world of Elden Ring. Messmer did terrible things in the name of his mother, only to be abandoned by her, and have a graceless tarnish chosen by Marika to be Elden Lord. A final insult to his son, who sacrificed everything, his freedom, his morals, and finally his life to remove the world of the graceless. Whilst Messmer's actions are reprehensible, like all characters in Elden Ring, there is a nuance and depth to him. And so in this lore video, we are going to explore the story of Messmer and his crusade against the Horn Scent, as I believe fully understanding the lore attached to Messmer is essential in enriching the background lore to the DLC as a whole. But before we get started, remember that if you like Elden Ring lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, as I have hours of lore content for you to enjoy. Before we get into today's video, I would like to give a brief word from today's sponsor, me, as I am happy to announce my Elden Ring lore book, Grace Given. I have worked with the folks at Toon and Fairweather to translate my love for the Elden Ring lore into book form, which represents my appraisal of the entire lore of the base game, clocking in at 500 plus pages. The result is this beautiful collector's item, adorned with the art of Shimhack, Menace LG, Elliot Wells, and Chris Lewis Lee. This is just the initial limited launch, and down the line there will be more affordable paperback or e-editions. Check it out at the pre-order link below if you think this would be something you are interested in. Thanks for listening, and now back to the lore. In the lead up to the DLC, we had trailers and we had interviews with Miyazaki that led us to the conclusion that Messmer was indeed a child of Marika, another demigod child of hers who we just had not heard of. And indeed that has proven to be the case, as there are numerous sources which name him as such, including from Messmer himself, who curses his mother, Marika, at the moment of his death. But for the sake of completeness and confirmation, one direct source that names him as the son of Marika is the Serpent Crest Shield, which reads the following: a finely made red shield featuring an engraving of a winged serpent. Excels at guarding against fire. Said to have been made to commemorate the beginnings of the crusade started by Messmer, son of Marika. So if Messmer is a son of Marika, then where does this put him generationally compared to the other demigod children? Well, I'm going to put my proposed thesis for these generations on the screen now, as we do have some clues where he fits in the timeline of the other demigod children. For example, there is Gaius' Remembrance, which names him and Gaius as an elder to Radahn, meaning he at least predates Radagon's marriage to Rennala and the children that came from that union. However, I think it's unlikely that he is a product of Godfrey and Marika's marriage, those known as the Golden Lineage. Firstly, because anyone from the Golden Lineage usually has a reference to it. It's almost central to their identity. Even Morgott, the Omen King of Leyndell, has a reference to the Golden Lineage in his Great Rune. And thus, if Messmer was also of this lineage, you'd expect it to be somewhere in his lore, and it isn't. Additionally, Messmer has some of the hallmarks of what we'd expect for children born of the Radagon-Marika union. The first letter of Messmer's name, after all, lines up with the naming convention of children born of this lineage. Miquella and Malenia also both start with an M, as does Messmer. And as I will suggest later on in this video, I believe that Melina is also a child of Radagon and Marika, and her name also begins with an M. But perhaps more importantly, Messmer has striking red hair, which is one of the strongest unifying features of Children of Radagon. Rykard, Radahn, even Ranni all have red hair, and so Messmer does seem likely to have been born from the red-haired champion. Messmer also shares something else in common with Miquella and Malenia. He is born cursed. Malenia's remembrance attributes her and Miquella's curse to the nature of their birth, as it reads, Miquella and Malenia are both the children of a single god. As such, they are both Empyreans, but suffered afflictions from birth. There is a link of causality between these afflictions and the fact they are children of a single god, a reference to Radagon and Marika, who are themselves a single-bodied god. This is likely a commentary on inbreeding, which was rampant in the medieval dynasties of real-world history, and it led to a lot of birth defects and issues. Though admittedly, this is just a surface-level thematic tie, as in the world of Elden Ring, these curses are actually cosmic. And if we are saying that Messmer is no different from Miquella and Malenia in terms of their heritage, then surely he too shares a curse of this nature. And he does. He is host to the Flame and an Abyssal Serpent. And we know that he was born with his curse, as Gaius' remembrance reads, both were as elder brothers to the Lion, and both were cursed from birth. Unfortunately, Messmer's father never really features into his lore, and so we never get an explicit mention as to who his father is, so we are just guessing. But I think with the red hair, the naming convention, and the curse that he is born with, I think it is quite likely that Messmer is yet another child born of Radagon and Marika, but an earlier, previously unknown generation. Miquella and Malenia came about after Radagon's marriage to Rennala, when he returned to Leyndell and became Elden Lord. And so, if Messmer is the elder to Radahn, this means that he was born of the Radagon-Marika union in a generation that we previously didn't know of. And this is why in my theoretical generational drop that I showed you earlier, I put Messmer as the earliest generation, predating even the Golden Lineage, because for me, perhaps this came about before Marika actually married Godfrey as her consort. That is obviously just a guess, but I feel like it wouldn't be right if she was having children with her other half, Radagon, at the same time that she had her new Lord Consort, Godfrey. But again, we are just speculating, so let me know your thoughts in the comments below where you think Messmer sits in relation to the Golden Lineage. Additionally, we know that Messmer had a younger sister, to which an oblique reference is made in Messmer's kindling, which reads, the kindling that burned inside Messmer the Impaler, a dark thing, eaten away at by a wicked serpent. Messmer, much like his younger sister, bore a vision of fire. Now, I do need to do a bit of housekeeping on this bit of lore before we go any further, as on Twitter or X, there's been a rumour flying around, being boosted by big accounts, that this reference to a sister was actually patched out secretly, as if implying this lore is no longer relevant and it was in there as a mistake. This is simply not true, and these accounts are getting the timeline of events muddled up. The case is this: in the pre-release version of the game, which I and others were able to play before there was a launch day patch, there was indeed no mention of a sister in this item. However, at launch, the patch added this reference, and ever since, from launch, there has been a reference to a sister, and it has not been removed since. You can go into the game now, get this item, and it will still have the reference to this sister. So for me, this is still the legitimate version of the item description that was intended by the developers, and if you're hearing rumours that this has been removed since, it's simply not true. So with that said, Messmer had another sister, one who also had a relationship to fire, and of course, this has to be none other than Melina. We have long known Melina is a daughter of Marika. She never explicitly says it, but she hints at it heavily by saying,
I'm searching for my purpose, given to me by my mother inside the Erdtree, long ago, for the reason that I yet live, burned and bodiless.
This mother within the Erdtree can be none other than Queen Marika, and we've always wondered where Melina sits in regards to the other generations of Demi-God children, and I believe we now have the answer. She is part of this previously unknown generation of fire, as I'm going to call it. If this is Melina, I think there's also some circumstantial evidence that helps reinforce what I've been saying about Messmer and Melina's generation being one of the first. As I highlighted in my story summary video, and thanks again to viewer David Zhu for bringing this to my attention, there is a new incantation in the DLC called Minor Erdtree, and this Minor Erdtree incantation is said to be a secret incantation of Queen Marika, and the incantation is relevant to Queen Marika's early history and her origins. And yet Melina uses this secret incantation if you summon her to help with the fight with Morgott. This implies that Melina had a close relationship with Marika, and that she was likely one of her earlier children, perhaps privy to the ancient parts of Queen Marika's history, and that is why she is the only character in-game that utilises this relic. Returning to the item description of Messmer's kindling, it describes how this daughter, this younger sister of Messmer, had a relationship to fire, had visions of fire, and Melina also has 3 potential relationships to fire. The first is that she of course would eventually be the kindling used to burn the Erdtree, as she does in our journey. The second is that her body was burned, and now she is burned and bodiless. And the third relation she has to fire is of course that in my opinion she is likely the Gloam-Eyed Queen, who brought the black flame of death against the gods. I believe all 3 of these things, and therefore at her core she has a relationship to fire. I don't think I'll do another video on Melina and the Gloam-Eyed Queen. I stated my case very clearly in my Gloam-Eyed Queen video, and I think there's nothing in the DLC that offers up a more viable candidate, and there's also no new lore that contradicts the fact that Melina is likely the Gloam-Eyed Queen. And if anything, I think this oblique reference in Messmer's kindling just strengthens the case. It reaffirms the fact that Melina is a daughter of Marika, and that she had visions of fire, even from her early days. And so I just want to say my final piece on Melina here. Consider, why is Melina burned and bodiless? What happened to her? Why is she not celebrated as part of the Pantheon? And why does she appear to have been imprisoned in a cell near the Forsaken Lands, as there is a locked room here where we can find her blade? Then of course we have the fact that Melina is well acquainted with destined death. And then of course we have the most obvious piece of evidence that in the Frenzied Flame ending, she reveals a purple gloam eye at the end of the game, whilst again threatening destined death against us. I would ultimately direct you towards my Gloam-Eyed Queen lore video if you'd like a more in-depth look at these arguments regarding Melina. But in short, I think Messmer's kindling at the very least reinforces the idea that Melina is a daughter of Marika, but it makes sense to me why both Melina and Messmer are essentially forgotten, and aren't a celebrated part of the Pantheon. Messmer was born with a darkness within him, and then sealed away in the lands of shadow, and Melina once led the horrifying Godskin apostasy in rebellion. Both members of the royal family that were likely struck from history, and would rather be forgotten about by the royal family. With that said, I do want to talk about Messmer and his relations to the other Demi-God children of Marika, as previously we hadn't had much evidence of interaction between the different generations of demigods, besides Miquella caring a lot for Godwyn. We know now from the remembrance of a god and a lord that Miquella's youth did coincide with Radahn's younger years. Of course, we don't know how many years lie between each of these generations, nor how long demigods actually live in this world, but I'm guessing a long time. And so it makes sense now that we know that these different generations can interact with one another, and that Miquella and Malenia were born close enough to Renalla's children, close enough at least that they would at least know each other in passing. We know from Radahn's greatswords that we can get from this remembrance that the resurrected Radahn we see at the end of the DLC is Radahn pre-Starscourge conflict, and this is likely the age he was when Miquella most remembers him. That's the reasoning I have in my head that Radahn is resurrected at this age rather than his later years, because it's the power of Miquella that's bringing Radahn back, and this is the age that Miquella most remembers Radahn at. And Radahn is almost like the centre point of this family now. If I'm right, and Messmer is the oldest of the family, and he interacted with Radahn being as an older brother to him, and Miquella is one of the youngest, and he also mixed with Radahn, then we can imagine that all the different generations of demigods interacted with one another, and I think this is pretty cool. And I definitely would have liked there to have been some interaction between Miquella and Messmer in the DLC, as the younger passed through his elder's domain. And it shows that Messmer was still around in the capital, at least up to the point that Radagon had married Rennala. And it was likely during the post-Radagon-Rennala marriage that Messmer would interact with another royal, Rellana. As we will discuss, Rellana would eventually become one of Messmer's most loyal followers, her remembrance naming her as Messmer's Blade. She would be loyal enough to Messmer that she would give up her titles and claims to royalty. This doesn't happen in a vacuum, she wouldn't just up and do it without knowing him. And thus I think it's fair to say that after Rennala tied her house to the Leyndell royal family, there would have been some intermingling and sharing of the duties between these two families, and Rellana and Messmer will have met. So now we have somewhat of an understanding where Messmer stands in the royal family tree. I want to go back a bit and focus now on that curse that we mentioned earlier, the Abyssal Snake. Messmer's curse is something we witness during stage 2 of his fight, when he becomes one with the base serpent that is contained within him. The Abyssal Serpent is a creature that was sealed behind his eye by his mother, Marika, as his remembrance reads the following. A malevolent snake writhed within Messmer, and so his very mother plucked out his eye and put in its place a seal of grace. Indeed, Messmer's eye is essentially the same model as Marika's rune, indicating that Marika's power is somehow keeping this Abyssal Serpent in place in his eye socket. In stage 2, when Messmer plucks out this eye and shatters it, it breaks into golden flakes, reinforcing the fact that this is not an eye at all, but is instead an artifact constructed entirely of grace. And this is the first indication that the power of the Abyss, or Dark, is an opposing force to grace. The Abyssal Serpent is a fascinating subject because it brings the importance of the Dark to the forefront of Elden Ring's lore. When talking about the Abyss in this chapter, there are two things I hope you'll get from it. The first is that the Abyss represents the Dark, and that the Dark is an opposing force to light and grace. And while the relationship between light and dark is more front and centre in Dark Souls, it is still very much present in Elden Ring, especially now in this DLC. The second point I hope you'll take away is that the Abyss is often related to the cosmos, the dark void of space, and in Elden Ring this is the domain of the celestial and the cosmic. There isn't much in-game lore that talks directly about the Abyssal Serpent. However, Messmer does say something of this serpent during Stage 2's transition.
I will not suffer. A lord devoid of light. No mother. Forgive me. Soon tarnished. Wilt thou be taken in the jaws of the Abyssal Serpent, shorn of light.
This is the Abyssal Serpent shorn of light, meaning cut off from light, already emphasising the role that the Abyss plays in Elden Ring's lore as the opposite of light. It is the bottomless dark, entirely absent of light. The Abyss and Serpents isn't something new to From Software. The Abyss was a major component of Dark Souls lore, with us first being introduced to it via Kath, the primordial serpent. The Abyss of Dark Souls is a massive lore subject in of itself, so excuse me while I reduce it to its most basic lore points for the purposes of this video. The Dark Souls world was once one of uniformity, a grey world where everything was the same. Then there was the advent of fire, a cosmic event that upended the rules of the universe, and the universe became one of duality and disparity. Life and death, heat and cold, light and dark. At the beginning of the Age of Fire, 4 great souls were found within the flame, 2 pairs of opposites, the soul of chaos, i.e. life, and the soul of death, making up 1 pair, and then there's the soul of light and the soul of dark. The abyss is essentially a consequence of light and a manifestation of the dark. All of this to say is that the abyss in Dark Souls is incredibly complicated, and there's a lot of symbolic meaning that you can draw from it. However, some of the most interesting and important ties are its opposing nature to light, and its natural tie to the abyss of space. The void of space itself is a dark plane of existence that is absent light, and is often referred to as the abyss. And as we look at the Abyssal Serpent further in this chapter, I think you'll find that these are the most relevant allusions that we can get from the abyss in Elden Ring as well. Fellow content creator Max Derat did an excellent video recently, which clearly illustrates the symbology behind the Abyssal Serpent. Max brings up alchemy, and how the idea of reconciling opposite halves, usually represented by red and white, is a concept often repeated in From Software games, but even more so in Elden Ring, with the idea of Marika and Radagon. The White Queen and the Red King merge together to form the Rebus, the personification of the Philosopher's Stone, the ultimate goal of alchemy. This symbolic illusion is something that has been well discussed on my channel and others at this point. However, Max brings up something else, and that is the bonding agent that is needed to bring these two halves together. And this is the god Mercurius. Mercurius is represented in many different ways, and in his video Max gives two main examples of the way Mercurius is portrayed. One being the void or space, and two being two intertwining snakes, or the caduceus. And of course, in both Elden Ring and in Dark Souls now, we have a snake and the abyss associated together in regards to the force of darkness, leaving us in no doubt the source of inspiration for From Software's depiction of the abyss in both games, and it helps explain why snakes and the abyss go together in both of these games. And the way that Max describes the cosmos or the void from an alchemical standpoint is very interesting as well. He describes it as the base material that binds everything together. Hence we have the base serpent of Messmer. Again, I would recommend Max's deep dive in full, as it's truly fascinating, but I just wanted to highlight the thematic and symbolic underpinnings of the Abyssal Serpent as a starting point for our discussion. While the Abyss does occupy its own lore in-game, it is undeniable that we are meant to think of the void and dark expanse of space, especially when we consider that even in the base game of Elden Ring, there are references to the Abyss and darkness already that are tied to the cosmos and the celestial beings within. Indeed, the lore surrounding Estelle, a living malformed star, often refers to the cosmos in a similar manner. Fellow content creator and translator Last Protagonist even suggests that the original Japanese for Estelle should be translated as Estelle, Spawn of Darkness, rather than Natural Born of the Void, which serves to highlight this connection between space and darkness. Indeed, if you use Estelle's remembrance, you can create waves of darkness, an ash of war, the powers of the void manifesting as dark energy. And this is an attack that Estelle can use himself as well, again connecting the celestial to the darkness and the abyss. The specific term abyss is actually used once in the base game of Elden Ring as well, and that is in Comet Azure, in reference to Azure peering through the primeval current and into the abyss of space. And now in the DLC we get further ties between the abyss and this concept of darkness. We find this in the Sword Hands of Night, for example, and the two that we meet in game are Yolan and Anna. Emir is their master, and is a thinker of Carian origin, who thinks deeply on the cosmos and its relation to the greater will. Thus his greatest weapons are a reflection of the dark cosmos, of the abyss, the dark of space absent light. For example, Yolan and Anna's ash read the following: "Together, Yolan's swords and Anna's claws are as bottomless black, and penetrate the enemy's guard. Yolan and Anna were born in a cold, dark jail, where they were raised, deprived of light, to be sword hands of night." Everything about these two is meant to reflect a dark, absent of light, essentially the abyss of space. Their weapons are bottomless black, and like space, The weapons are incorporeal, and thus pass through shields and blocks. Anna and Yolan were even raised in a jail to be deprived of light, to reflect that darkness of the cosmos. All of this to say is that there are elements of Elden Ring that touch on this idea of an abyss that is often related to the cosmic realm, and to inhuman entities that exist outside of our terrestrial realm. However, unlike the other references to the abyss or cosmos which focus on the beings that exist within this void, the Abyssal Serpent seems to be a manifestation of that darkness itself. Perhaps then this is enough for us to go on. Perhaps the Abyssal Serpent is just another cosmic being, an outer god of the void, or the vassal of an outer god. Malenia has the scarlet rot within her, the influence of an outer god, and thus it is possible that Messmer, another demigod of the same lineage, also caught the attention of some creature of an outer god, and as such it took root within him, like a parasite, a tapeworm of unfathomable power, that has been with him since his birth. The serpent is cosmic in its behaviours. Behind Messmer's eye there is a dark void, an abyss that seems to go deeper than is physically possible within his head. You can see the snake coiled within his eye, and yet when the serpent manifests fully, it is massive. So while the base serpent inhabits a relatively small space within Messmer's eye socket, clearly there are some spatial anomalies at play here, pointing to the fact that this is a cosmic creature beyond the normal rules of the terrestrial realm. The aesthetic choices for the serpent also line up somewhat with the elements of Dark Souls, again perhaps implying it has a similar nature to the abyss of that game. We can see red eyes that line its body, and when it summons duplicates they too have these multiple red eyes. And these multiple red eyes remind me of Manus and the Ulusil residence. Much like Dark was the opposing force of light in Dark Souls, I think the DLC really reinforces the opposing forces of light and dark as well, with Grace, the Erdtree, and other things relating to the greater will being the representatives of light, life, and order. Whereas on the other side we have things such as dark, disorder, and chaos. I felt like the base game focused more on the differences between life and death, with the removal of the Rune of Death and the Place of Death being a major focus of the base game's lore. But the remembrance of the Erdtree avatar makes it clear that everything contrary to the Erdtree is reflected and contained within the Erdtree and the realm of shadow, as it reads, "The Erdtree is the shadow of the Erdtree, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stalk, rendering it brittle." Dark notions that bear no sense of order is a very interesting use of words. The Erdtree, Elden Ring, and Greater Will are often associated with order, everything gold essentially. The Elden Beast's remembrance even tells us that the Beast and Elden Ring were the embodiment of order. In each of the Elden Lord endings, we repair the Elden Ring and bring about a new age. The configuration of the Elden Ring can be very different in each variant, but one thing unites them. We bring order back to the world. Indeed, in symbology, dark is often associated with disorder and chaos, whereas light is often associated with order and structure, as it is in the system of yin and yang, and as it was in Dark Souls. All of that to say is that dark really is a force in the cosmic rules of Elden Ring, and it is partially represented and contained by the Erdtree, given it is the shadow or dark of the Erdtree, which is the light to the world. And there is another display of the power of the dark in the DLC that we can potentially tie to the Erdtree, and I'm referring to the obscuring of Anir Elim by the Sealing Tree, which seems to coat the tower in dark. We know from Empyrean Grandam's dialogue that it was Marika's people who sealed the tower in shadow.
Our lands were by thy kind set aflame, our tower by thy kind veiled in shadow.
Shadow is essentially the power of obscuring, of hiding things from the light. But how are they able to do this? Well, a Twitter user called Liam Hawes reached out to me and made a really interesting observation that I really like. The Sealing Tree is actually the same shape of half of the Erdtree. To me, the implication is clear. Marika's followers used the dark power within the Erdtree to obscure the tower. The Erdtree is the vessel for dark and shadow, thus it is these powers that are being utilised here. In the DLC we start to get further emphasis on the Erdtree and Grace's relation to light, mainly through Sir Messmer's dogma and dialogue. When he recognises that we, Marika's Lord-elect, is a tarnished, he reacts with surprise.
That tarnished, it seemeth. Mother, wouldst thou truly lordship sanction in one so bereft of light?
The way in which he describes us here is very interesting. Not bereft of grace, but bereft of light. He sees grace and the lack of it in terms of light and dark. And it might not be too surprising that he thinks of it in this way, given the darkness that he has within himself. Indeed, this does seem to be reinforced by his lines should he kill you in stage 2 of his fight.
O lightless creature, embrace thine oblivion, as shall I.
Perhaps his grace purity dogma is one born of self-hatred, for the lightless void that exists within him, being an opposite force to grace. Indeed, further evidence that the Abyss stands in opposition to grace and the Erdtree is the very fact that Marika's seal of grace is successful in holding back the serpent. Her light holds back the Abyss within Messmer. And there are hints that this opposing duality of light and dark goes further back than even the Erdtree. We can find the swords of darkness and light within this new DLC. The base variant of these swords, the stone-sheathed sword, tells us that this is an artifact of an ancient civilization, and given Ra lies within these lands, and one of the altars, the Altar of Light, is found there, it must be a remnant of that civilization. Thus, the representation of light and dark predates the Erdtree, given Ra was an ancient civilization. It's just that the Erdtree is the most recent representation of order, light, and life. But dark and light has always existed in the world of Elden Ring. I therefore find it fascinating that the DLC focuses so heavily on this concept, and ultimately I see the serpent as a manifestation of darkness and the void, a cosmic being that draws on the power of darkness, and until now has been held back by the power of grace and light. The next thing I want to talk about is how the Abyssal Serpent affected Messmer's flame. In Messmer's kindling, it calls his flame a dark thing that has been eaten away by the Abyssal Serpent. We have talked in detail in the previous chapter about the power of the dark that exists within Elden Ring, and that the Abyssal Serpent is a coalescence of that power. And as such, it's no surprise that the fire within Messmer has also been afflicted by the Abyss, by the dark of this serpent. And this is why it's got a slightly dark colouring to it, and it's why Messmer's flame can be used for other things like necromancy, a fact we'll get into in the next chapter. Additionally, the serpent's relationship to Messmer's flame can be seen in the way that it manifests. The flame spreads out, coils and moves like a serpent, with the ember of Messmer even being described as taking a serpentine form. This just really emphasises the sheer power of this creature that's within Messmer. It has made his flame truly unique, dark and serpentine in nature. Messmer's orb tells us how Messmer despised his own flame, and I initially assumed this was just because of how fire is viewed within Erdtree society, given the burning of the Erdtree is viewed as the first cardinal sin, and fire in general is viewed unfavourably. However, on reflection, and after writing this past chapter on the Abyssal Serpent, I can't help but think the reason Messmer hated his fire so much was because it would always be a reminder of the darkness that lies within him, the blasphemous abyss. The parasitic nature of the serpent is also illustrated in the way that it and Messmer seem to become one when the seal of grace is removed. After all, in the second phase he is called Base Serpent Messmer. They are one being. They move as one, with the Abyssal Serpent sometimes taking control before ceding it back to Messmer. Messmer's orb is one of his signature moves in stage 1. It's the one he opens with usually, where he dives into the air before bringing an orb down upon the enemy. However, in stage 2, The Abyssal Serpent also opens with this move, before the Abyssal Serpent melts away and Messmer is left standing there. They are one and the same. If you look carefully at the Abyssal Serpent, you will see that it is missing an eye. And the reason it's missing an eye is because Messmer is now also missing an eye. They are one and the same being in this stage 2. And I want to shout out Bonfire VN, because if not for Bonfire's excellent Messmer video, I may not have noticed these details, and that video will be linked below and I highly recommend you watch it. There are other signs of how they are one and the same. If you look at the serpent's body, you can see Messmer's red hair all over its body. And in stage 2, Messmer's skin has become mottled like the snake skin. It has possessed his body. They are not fighting alongside each other. They are one. This is what Marika has prevented all these years with the power of grace and light. The Abyssal Serpent was there, yes, but it didn't take over Messmer. The power of light held back the dark from consuming Messmer entirely, although it did eat away at his flame. No wonder the Horn Scent gets such sadistic pleasure in seeing the nightmare of his people reduced so.
Upon his end, did you see Messmer's face? 'Twas sublime. A very tangle of snakes. To think he dared call us savages, when he himself was most base of all.
Now that we've talked about the abyssal aspect of the base serpent, there are some further observations I want to make about serpents in general. And the first are how Messmer's winged serpents play into all of this. I find the winged serpent helm a good place to start, as it reads the following. Helm of Kud, Captain of the Fire Knights. A winged serpent perches atop it. The winged serpent is a token creature of Messmer's military forces. It is a wise friend, which keeps the base serpent at bay and holds its power in check. These serpents do not seem to be connected to the base serpents. They are companions of Messmer's, wrapped around his body and are somehow able to help him resist the power of the Abyssal Serpent. Additionally, they may also play another role by acting as his eyes. When we first enter the room, it is one of the serpents that studies us, and Messmer almost seems to see through its eyes that we are tarnished. This would make sense, given his mother has seemed to have plucked out his only eye and replaced it with a seal of grace. In the second stage, he is definitely blind, given his seal of grace has been removed. However, whether he's seeing through his winged serpents or the Abyssal Serpent at this stage is unknown. Whatever purpose the winged serpents serve, they are not part of the base serpent, and in fact, they seem to suffer with Messmer when he releases the Abyssal Serpent. We see them charred by the black flame as well, and they turn from red to white. And Messmer's helm reads the following. They were there when the base serpent was sealed behind his eye. They were there through his eternity of suffering. They will accompany him yet in his hideous new form, born when he destroyed the grace granted by his mother. They have accepted his fate as much as he. With that said, I want to go back to the description of the winged serpent helm, as there are a couple of other things to note here. The description tells us that it's the token creature of Messmer's military forces, and explains the serpent imagery used by his forces. And this opens up an interesting discussion around serpents in general, because we know the serpents were viewed as negative within Erdtree society. So how did Messmer's forces get away with adorning themselves with serpents? We know from Black Knight Commander Andreas's ashes that he and his son Hugh, and others, rebelled against Messmer after learning about his serpentine nature. And this must have been the Abyssal Serpent. His troops must have been fine with his winged serpents that he kept as companions. After all, they were ultimately the sigil that he chose to bear as his coat of arms and the symbol of his military forces, so this wasn't the reason that Hugh and Andreas chose to rebel. It must have been discovering the nature of the base serpent within Messmer. After all, let us not forget the Serpent Crest shield, a shield meant to commemorate the Crusade that proudly and overtly sports the serpent upon it. The winged serpents are accepted and even adorned by his troops. Prior to release, I did a lore preview video, which was based on my 3 hours with the game that I got to play before launch, and it was semi-speculative based on the lore I was able to uncover in those 3 hours in the early areas of the game. One of the items I had access to in that preview was Black Knight Andreas's ashes, and I meditated on the meaning of this description without having further context of the rest of the DLC. I reflected that the wording around Andreas's reason for rebelling about Messmer's serpentine nature must have meant that the serpent was already viewed as something negative within Erdtree society. We know that gladiatorial games used to be held in the great arenas of Leyndell and elsewhere in the lands between, and that the serpent was the object of ire within these games. For example, the duelist helm reads the following: bronze helm decorated with innumerable snakes, worn by gladiators who were driven from the Colosseum. The snake is viewed as a traitor to the Erdtree, and the audience delighted in seeing these bronze effigies beaten and battered. So at some stage, the hatred for snakes was established in Erdtree society, to the point that they were routinely and ritually humiliated in the arenas. Much like in the UK, every November 5th, people burn effigies of Guy Fawkes on bonfires. So in the past 2 years of lore study, myself and others have ruminated on what event could have led to this. Why are serpents considered traitors to the Erdtree? Bearing in mind that the word traitor means they were once aligned with the Erdtree, but somehow betrayed their trust. And now we have to reconcile that lore with how Messmer, a Demi-God son of the royal family of the Erdtree, was able to wear serpents proudly upon his coat of arms. Tarnished Archaeologist made a compelling argument in a video that the serpent may have been involved with the Glomide Queen, given the presence of a godskin noble at the Temple of Iglay, the temple dedicated to the Great Serpent, and the serpentine nature of the godskins as well. If the serpent Iglay was allied to the godskins and the Glomide Queen, it could explain why they were considered a traitor to the Erdtree. Tim Diggity in a really interesting video went even further, suggesting that the Glomide Queen may well have been a serpent themselves, and I encourage you to watch both of these excellent videos, which will be linked below. Whatever the reason you believe that the serpents were viewed as negative by the Erdtree society, we need to somehow explain how Messmer was able to take the serpent as his symbol in a time like this. Consider the wording of Andreas's ashes. This is someone who's clearly loyal to Messmer, even choosing to leave the Erdtree with Messmer, and by this time Messmer will clearly have been having the snake as his sigil. So why is this not a problem for Andreas, yet his serpentine nature is? If the serpent was already hated by the time the Crusade happened, how do we explain people giving up so much to join Messmer's side? Well, there are a few possibilities to consider. The first is the most simple one, and that is that Messmer taking the treasonous serpent as his sigil was seen as acceptable, as it's merely a fearsome choice for a coat of arms. A simple but not particularly satisfying explanation, to be sure. Another explanation is that the serpent was indeed already viewed with suspicion, and Messmer chose it nonetheless, opening himself up to public criticism. One of the lore items that I find very interesting in the DLC is the Fire Knight Helm, as it reads the following: each and every knight hailed from a renowned family of the Erdtree's upper echelons, but were shunned and chased from their homes after pledging allegiance to Messmer as their master. This straight up tells us that those who chose to align themselves with Messmer were immediately disdained, becoming excluded from the Erdtree society's upper echelons, and perhaps a large part of this was because of Messmer's coat of arms. As we will discuss in the coming chapters, it seems as though Messmer willingly took on the role of the Impaler in order to take the blame for his mother's machinations. His armour set reads the following: black armour of Messmer the Impaler, draped with a red cloak bearing his crest embroidered. On his mother's wishes, Messmer made himself a symbol of fear, undertaking the cleansing crusade she desired. Direct thy maledictions, thine ire, and thy grief towards me alone. First Light tells us that Messmer became this symbol of fear on his mother's wishes. He stylized himself as the Impaler, and became this great villain on her orders. Additionally, it has a quote from him that implies Messmer is wanting those who may hate the Crusade and its actions to direct their hatred towards him alone. In my full story summary video, I suggested that the reason that those who follow Messmer were shunned was because Marika publicly distanced herself from the Crusade and allowed Messmer and his followers to take public blame for such a controversial and brutal campaign, despite the fact she in reality ordered Messmer to do this. A political move that her son readily agreed to, and perhaps his brazen taking of the serpent as his sigil was just a further calculation to draw criticism away from his mother and towards himself. I think it would have been nice if we would have been able to see Messmer as the reason that the serpent is viewed as a traitor, as this would all line up nicely with what I've just said, that he was publicly blamed for this crusade, and thus he could have been denounced as a traitor, and at that point going forward the serpent, his sigil, would have been seen as treasonous to the Erdtree. However, unfortunately, it seems like the timeline wouldn't line up with this. I've already discussed the fact that the serpent was beaten in the arenas, and this was a practice that was really under Godfrey. And by the time Radagon was Elden Lord, these practices had all but died out. And as I will suggest in the later chapters, I think Messmer's crusade took place after the Liurnian Wars and after Radagon's marriage to Rennala, and in fact, it may have been after Godfrey and his Tarnished were banished from the lands between, because Messmer knows what a Tarnished is. And if the arenas were closed down by the time Radagon was Elden Lord, this would leave a very small gap between when Godfrey was banished and when Radagon became Elden Lord for Messmer to go on his crusade and give serpents their bad name so they were used as effigies in the arena. It just doesn't quite line up as neatly as I'd want it to. However, it is definitely possible that Messmer is the reason they are viewed as traitors, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. There are a few other loose ends regarding serpents that I want to talk about in this chapter before we move on to the crusade proper. The first is a bit of a mystery that was discovered by various Twitter users, and it was first brought to my attention by user Messy Hair, and thank you so much for tagging me in this as I had genuinely not noticed this. Messy Hair shared a screenshot of something interesting that can be found near Bonnie Village, a giant snakeskin. What are we to make of this relic? It is too big to be one of the winged serpents of Messmer, and yet I agree with Messy Hair's assessment that we are to somehow connect this to Messmer. Nearby you can find the O Mother gesture, and the term O Mother is one that Messmer explicitly uses in the stage 2 cinematic of his boss fight. So did Messmer shed this skin? It is possible that this skin was shed by his Abyssal Serpent, as the size isn't too much of a mismatch, and that is definitely the simplest explanation. However, one can't help but notice it's a very similar model to that of Iglay, the god-devouring serpent of Rykard, and in fact the skin is almost the same model as the skin you can find in the Temple of Iglay. Did this Abyssal Serpent of Messmer once give birth to Iglay, or are they connected? I can certainly see this Abyssal Serpent somehow being tied to all serpents, but I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. With the discussion of serpents at an end, it's now time to talk about the Crusade itself and the purge of the Towerfolk. I've discussed the timeline for the Crusade itself in the past two videos, but let's discuss it again here just for completeness sake. A good place to start when trying to place the Crusade in the greater timeline of Elden Ring is the decorative fire giant heads that can be found on the legs of the furnace golems. If this is being used as the iconography by Messmer's forces, it means that these must have been constructed after the War of the Giants, and the Crusade must have taken place after this event as well. This war against the fire giants, according to the sword monument that's found on the mountaintops of the giants, marked the end of the Erdtree initial conquest wars, and was the beginning of the age of the Erdtree proper. This means that the crusade against the Hornsent was not part of the initial wars of the Erdtree when it first emerged, as I had initially assumed pre-release, and because of this iconography alone we can place the crusade firmly after the War of the Giants. This does however raise questions about Messmer's potential involvement in this war. We have all long speculated about what actually impaled the fire giants. We see their corpses all over the mountaintops of the giants, with their bodies pierced by a big spear. Perhaps it was the impaler that impaled the fire giants. However, I'm probably still in the camp that believes that the fire giants were pierced by some thorn sorcery of some kind, given the arboreal nature of these spears with thorns growing out of them, and the fact that you can find smaller versions of these stakes in the camps that include thorn sorcerers. However, it's an interesting possibility to consider that Messmer was involved in this war, and I invite you to watch my Bloodstar video where I go into this subject in more detail, and to leave your thoughts in the comments below. The Crusade must have come after the Wars of Liurnia, as it must come after the marriage of Radagon and Rennala, which ended those wars. As we've mentioned, Gaius' remembrance tells us that Messmer was as an older brother to Radahn in his youth, who is of course a son of Rennala and Radagon. And so if there was a period where Messmer was as an older brother to Radahn, then his crusade must come after Radagon and Renala's marriage and the birth of their children. Then we have Rellana, sister to Rennala, who joined Messmer, meaning the houses of the Erdtree and the Moon must be allies by this stage, as prior to this they were very hostile to one another, and as such Rellana would have been unlikely to ally with Messmer before this. Rellana's helmet even tells us that she gets the blessing of her older sister Rennala, which definitely wouldn't have happened had the houses of the Erdtree and the Moon still been at war with one another. I place this crusade as later during the Erdtree era, prior to the Shattering, but after the Tarnished and Godfrey were banished from these lands. I've mentioned this already, but Messmer knows exactly what a Tarnished is, meaning he must have been around for Godfrey and his warriors being banished. The Tarnished is a specific term, and we know that Messmer could likely recognise that we are graceless, but the fact he uses this specific term against us means he must know what a Tarnished is, and thus he must have been there for Godfrey's banishment. However, I discussed this timeline with Ratatoskor in a podcast, which I will link below as we had some great discussions, and Ratatoskor made the great point that despite the fact it must have come after Godfrey's banishment, it must have been in the period before Radagon became Elden Lord. The description for Rennala's set reads the following: when Rennala, head of both the Academy of Rhea Lucaria and the Carian royal family, lost her husband Radagon, her heart went along with him. And then those at the Academy realised that Rennala was no champion after all. Meriel expands upon what happened to Rennala after Radagon left her.
Sadly, her heart was broken when Lord Radagon left her. And then, when the Academy rebelled against the royals, she was locked away in the Grand Library. In the end, Lady Rennala was left alone, cradling the amber egg Lord Radagon bequeathed her. Now she devotes herself to it through forbidden rite, the grim art of reincarnation.
After Radagon left her, she fell into despair, cradling the amber egg he left behind. And, aside from this, she was stripped of her power and imprisoned by Rhea Lucaria. And thus it's very unlikely that Rellana would have left her at this point if her sister was imprisoned, nor would she have received her sister's blessing as is described by Rellana's helmet after this time. So yes, it must be after Godfrey was banished, but before Radagon had returned to the Erdtree capital and become Elden Lord. This is pretty solid evidence in of itself, but there are some other hints and clues that reinforce the fact that Messmer's crusade took place later on in the timeline. For example, we have Rykard's virgin abductors present at the Fort of Reprimand, again meaning that Rykard had been born, grown up, and had developed his ideology enough to create these monstrous contraptions that he clearly lent to his stepbrother Messmer for this crusade. Additionally, there are Omen Killers at the Fort of Reprimand, and the Omen Killers are a part of an ideology that developed later on in Erdtree history. As we know from the Crucible Knight gauntlets, that the things of the Crucible were not disdained initially, it was after some time that they became disdained, and thus the Omen Killers would be a product of later Erdtree ideology. And I'm sure no one has any trouble accepting that this took place before the Shattering, the Crusade I mean, but there is another detail that does reinforce this. Twitter user Fever made a really great point regarding Messmer. He does not drop a great rune, and not only does that make his power level very impressive because he is exerting his power without being boosted by a great rune, but it also means that he was already sealed in the Lands of Shadow by the time of the Shattering, as he never claimed a great rune like the other demigods. With that said about the timeline, let us talk about Messmer's role within the Crusade itself. We have already looked at Messmer's armour set, which tells us that Messmer became the Impaler, a symbol of fear that's clearly modelled on Vlad the Impaler, on his mother's orders. Additionally, we get further corroborating evidence that it was Queen Marika who ordered Messmer to do this crusade, via Leyndell, who says the following.
Long ago, Queen Marika commanded Sir Messmer to purge the Tower folk.
And so Messmer decked himself out in red, took the serpent as his symbol, and would spread fear and death through the lands of shadow with his impaling spears and his black flame. But what was the impetus for this crusade? Well, there are two main reasons as I see it. First of all is the most obvious, to destroy those without grace and bury Marika's secrets with it. And the second reason is to get rid of Messmer, who Marika feared because of the abyss within him. Let's start with the reason number one, the public reason for the crusade, the cleansing of the graceless. The term crusade in of itself tells us that this was a war not for conquest or political reasons, rather it's a war prosecuted in line with a belief system, or a religion. To the most zealous of this crusade, it was a sacred duty killing those without grace. The term sacred is even used in the Crusaders' insignia. We know from the base game lore that those associated with the Crucible and without grace were eventually persecuted under the Golden Order's regime. A good primary source for this is found in the Crucible talismans of Knot, Scale and Feather, which read the following. A vestige of the Crucible of primordial life, born partially of devolution. It was considered a signifier of the divine in ancient times, but is now increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization has advanced. And we see this persecution everywhere in the contextual evidence. The Omen are imprisoned deep below Leyndell, or have their horns excised. We also have the misbegotten enslaved at places like Morn Castle, and otherwise they are pushed out to the fringes of Grace Society, to areas like the consecrated Snowfield and the Erdtree. Likewise, the Crucible Knights of Godfrey, heroes of their time, are steadily pushed out and disdained for their power, a fact that we learn from their gauntlet item descriptions. What this gauntlet and the aforementioned talismans tell us is the surface reason for the hate, the aesthetic reasons. The age of the Erdtree is a time of civilization and conformity, and as Radataskor put it in our podcast together, the Crucible is the age of evolution. Those of the age of the Erdtree believe that they've reached the perfect image, the perfect stage of evolution, and everything else that came before them is barbaric or chaotic, unlike the refined image of man that exists under the Golden Order. But the hatred runs a little deeper, and the Omen are a good entry point into understanding this reason. The Remembrance of Morgott reads the following. Though born one of the graceless Omen, Morgott took it upon himself to become the Erdtree's protector. The Omen, like Morgott, are graceless, and we can understand how if we look more closely at the Dung Eater's quest and what he does. The Dung Eater is of course inspired by the Omen, the outcasts of Erdtree society, and one can see that from his Omen-inspired armour, and as such he spreads their curse. When he kills someone he defiles their corpse, and they are afflicted with the Seedbed Curse, the description of which reads the following. Curse grown on a corpse, killed and defiled by the Dung Eater, a tender pox afflicted with Omen horns. The Dung Eater cultivates the Seedbed Curse on corpses. By doing so, he prevents dead souls returning to the Erdtree, leaving them forever cursed, one of the most loathsome things found in all the lands between. So part of the Omen curse is that they are essentially not part of the cycle of life that goes through the Erdtree, and this is a massive issue for people within Leyndell society, as they see the Erdtree as the divine nexus of life for everything in the lands between. The reason they hate the Omen is similar to the reason that they hate the Albinaurics. The best lore item in the game, the Albinauric Bloodclot, reads the following. Albinaurics are life forms made by human hands, thus many believe them to live impure lives, untouched by the Erdtree's grace. They are untouched by the Erdtree's grace because they are artificially created. Anything graceless or disconnected from the Erdtree is seen as impure, whether it be Omen or artificial creatures. This hatred runs so deep that even the blood of graceless beings is seen as dirty or tainted, For example, the Albinort pot reads the following: "The Knights of the Cuckoo do declare, behold thy defiled blood, unlike any humour that flows in our grand realm." Likewise, we can see the hatred that the self-hating Morgott has for his own tainted blood, as he says the following in his Phase 2 transition when his omen blood is unleashed and spills all over the thrones of the Erdtree.
"The thrones, stained by my curse, such shame I cannot bear. Thy part in this shall not be forgiven."
This disgust of beings that are graceless clearly carries over into this crusade as they go to slaughter the Hornsent, clearly an omen equivalent people whose blood is likewise corrupted. We know that the Crucible's power is still strong in the lands of Shadow, and that its influence causes creatures to grow horns. The Beast Horn item reads the following: "The Crucible has a particularly strong influence on the beasts of the realm of Shadow, causing many to grow horns despite the characteristics of their species." The Hornsent are very much like the Omen, in that they grow horns as a result of the Crucible's influence. They are not part of the Erdtree system. To the most zealous of Erdtree society, these Hornsent would be no better than the Omen that are already persecuted underneath them. With this in mind, I find the item description for the Black Knight helm very interesting, as it reads the following: "Helm worn by the Black Knights, servants of Messmer the Impaler, black iron ornamented with gold. A rotten odour stubbornly clings to it. Perhaps it arises from the tainted nature of the blood that splattered upon it. Or perhaps it is the wearer's own blackened soul, festering after endless slaughter." I enjoy the commentary of this item description as it plays upon the perception of the beholder. Is it the rotten smell of the blood of the unclean, or is it a soul burdened with brutal murder? Either way, it alludes to this anti-grace sentiment that would have been at the forefront for the believers of the Crusade, that those of the Hornsent are graceless, and their blood impure. And to me it makes perfect sense that the Omen Killers are also here part of this crusade. To them, the Hornsent would be no different from their usual quarry. Indeed, this grace purity dogma is repeated by one of the most zealous warriors of the crusade, Fire Knight Quillen, who says the following:
"Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death in the embrace of Messmer's flame."
This war was a purge, with those leading it believing strongly in the cause, lining up with the anti-Crucible sentiment of the modern Golden Order fundamentalists. These crusaders clearly came here for Queen Marika, setting up idols and churches in her name, cleansing the lands of the graceless, a stain on their rule. Marika is the goddess of grace ultimately, and thus a crusade undertaken to destroy those bereft of grace is a cause in her name. As such, they bring their Marika worship with them. This is a crusade, a religious crusade after all. We have the Church of the Crusade found in Skadu Altus, that has a statue of Marika at its heart. The Crusaders brought their religion with them, and this church clearly acted as a hub for the Marika faithful, as they persecuted their business. Hence why Fire Knight Quillen is praying directly to Queen Marika in multiple instances. He is under the impression that he is serving her directly by killing the graceless, a stain on her grace.
"Favour me with thy grace. I have met many who would threaten or distress thee, and quelled each and all, and I hereby swear to never cease. So please, grant me thy grace. Leave me with my solitary light."
Messmer also seems to buy into this dogma, as he fights us on the basis of the fact that we are graceless, despite the fact his mother has elected us as the new Elden Lord. His belief runs so deep that he will not stomach an Elden Lord that is tarnished, even if his mother has chosen them. He goes as far to unleash the Abyssal Serpent to stop us. At the end of it all, he does curse his mother, so perhaps he was just holding on to this hatred and belief because he had to, because otherwise all the terrible acts he committed in his mother's name were for nothing. He committed a horrible slaughter in his mother's name, taking the blame, and he had to believe in the cause in order to perpetrate these crimes, otherwise he would never have got through it. But if his mother has elected a graceless lord anyway, how important could this cause have really been? As I suggested at the beginning of this chapter, I believe the second and potentially main reason that Marika asked Messmer to do this was so she would have a chance to seal Messmer off in the Land of Shadows. So perhaps to her it was meaningless in the first place. But we'll talk more about that in the final chapter. Let us now talk about those who actually participated in this crusade, as there's a lot of interesting details to the players involved. At the top of the Crusade's command structure are two characters of great renown, the first of which is Gaius, Messmer's friend from years past and a student of the Alabaster Lord of Celia, and Gaius was the overall commander of Messmer's forces, no surprise given his martial prowess and bond of trust that would exist between him and the Impaler, all details that we get from his remembrance. Gaius also had a friendly rivalry with Radahn, but was the most senior of his disciples, and as such, he is able to unleash some pretty powerful gravitational spells, almost on the level of Radahn. Additionally, we know Gaius was an Albinauric, and we learn this via his greaves, that drop from the Albinauric found behind his arena. One can't help but wonder if this Albinauric was his companion or friend, but either way the item description explains the reason he is mounted upon a boar all the time. Like the female and older Albinaurics, he hasn't got the use of his legs. I do wonder how much Messmer actually believed truly in the Crusade's cause. Here he is purging those who are graceless, and cursing out the tarnished when we meet him, while his right-hand man is a graceless artificial being. But Gaius is the start of a pattern that those closest to Messmer are very loyal to him, willing to give up a lot. He is someone who commands great loyalty, and that pattern continues with our second figure at the top of his command structure, R'hllana, known as Messmer's Blade, who brought a whole contingent of Carian Lazuli sorcerers and troll knights with her, bolstering Messmer's ranks with much needed magical support. Then we have the elite Fire Knights, those who serve directly under Messmer, and their closeness to Messmer is why we find them all throughout the specimen storeroom, where Messmer himself is located. It's clear that those who belong to the Fire Knights were those who knew Messmer best, as the armour set for the Fire Knights reads the following: Armour of the Fire Knights under Messmer the Impaler's personal command, distinguished by its red cape and twin golden snakes which adorn the neck, enhancing incantations of Messmer's flame. These were the only ones who truly knew Messmer, his flames like serpents, the painful fate that accompanied his accursed form. So this is truly fascinating. The Fire Knights are those that knew Messmer's darkest secrets. The implication of this armour set is clear. They knew the truth about what lay within Messmer, his flame, and the Abyssal Serpent. They know the reason why his flames move like serpents. As a result of knowing him so intimately, their armour set and armaments reflect Messmer. They adorn themselves in his twin serpents. They wear his red cape. And they are able to use Messmer incantations, rather than just using the usable item Fire Coil, like the basic soldiery have to do. These are close confidants and friends to Messmer, those he trusts implicitly with his darkest secrets. We've already looked at the Fire Knight helm in the previous chapters, but to reiterate the lore that's contained within it, these knights all came from the aristocracy of Leyndell. Coming from noble backgrounds themselves, it means that these families likely knew Messmer before the war, moving in the same circle as the royal family during peacetime. It would therefore make sense that they have an existing relationship with him, a reason to be loyal to him, to the point where they would abandon everything, their title and their status, to follow him. What I really like about the Fire Knights is it's not just a homogeneous group. There are different sects and ranks within this elite circle. There are specific characters that stand out. It's almost like the Round Table of King Arthur. For example, we do have the standard Fire Knights with their pointed helms, but there are individuals among the Fire Knights who have their own affectations and style. For example, there is Wago, found in the Church District, and his Death Mask helm reads the following: Helm of Wago, Elder among the Fire Knights, 2 warped death masks stacked one atop the other. Gnawed at by loneliness, the old man turned his attention to the spirituality of Messmer's flame, using it in a rite of resurrection. Yet the soulless bodies he brought to life were no comfort to Wago. And so yeah, this is the practice of necromancy that can be achieved through Messmer's Flame that I alluded to earlier. With Wago, this specialised Fire Knight, using Messmer's Flame as a spiritual medium to resurrect the dead, as we see him do in the Church District. And Wago's not the only specialised individual within the Fire Knights. We have other characters like the Captain of the Knights, Kud, who wears the unique helm of the Winged Serpents, and guards the doors to Messmer's chamber. Then we have one of the most zealous members, Quillen, whose loyalty to the cause goes above Messmer, as he sees himself as a servant of Marika herself, striking down the graceless in her name. However, not all members of the Fire Knights were so extreme. Some were seemingly more reflective about the slaughter that they were committing. There is a special member of the Fire Knights who we fight when crossing the bridge to Ra, Salza. Salza is a sage of the Fire Knights, who seems to have more impressive command of Messmer's incantations than other knights. And we learn a little bit about this sage from his hood item description, which reads the following. Hood of Salza, Sage of the Fire Knights. A prestigious amount of cloth wound around it, giving the impression of a greatly swollen head. A disciple of the elder Wago, he refused to burn down an old ruin, at the risk of his own life. Salza is a sage of the Fire Knights and seems to have a more impressive command of Messmer's incantations than any other knight, and we see this display of power when we try to cross the bridge into Ra, where he rains down fire from above. This makes sense, given his hood explains that he is a disciple of Wago, the Elder Knight we just discussed. Wago himself used Messmer's Flame in very creative and powerful ways, and so it makes sense that Salza, being his disciple, would also have a great command over its power. But Salza's destructive power is a contrast to his temperament, as again, looking at his hood's item description, we can see that he was reluctant to destroy a certain town using his power. Additionally, we get further insight into this character via his iconic incantation, Rain of Fire, which reads the following. Salza's disdain for barbarism never waned, even as he burned more villages and scorched more land than any other. Salza clearly did his part as a crusader and knight loyal to Messmer, but clearly hated wanton violence, and as such it was Salza, and those who agreed with him, that would push for the specimen storehouse to be a thing. We learn of this from the Ashes of Fire Knight Hilde, which reads the following. Hilde was a dear friend to Salza the sage, and joined those who urged that the specimens be preserved. Hilde's ashes were enshrined as a charm to protect the storehouse. There was clearly a faction within the Fire Knights, led by Salza and Hilde, that felt some kind of remorse over what they were doing, and while the Specimen Hall isn't exactly an emotional tribute to the slaughtered Hornsent, to people like Salza and Hilda, it was the least they could do to at least preserve the memory of those they were exterminating in one form or another, even if it was just for history's sake. The fact that an entire Specimen Hall was constructed within the Black Keep shows how much influence these Fire Knights actually had with Messmer, as Messmer clearly would have had to greenlight this project as it's within his own keep, and this would be a pretty massive undertaking, and so to be able to convince Messmer the Impaler to be able to do this, they must have been pretty close to him. These are close members of Messmer's inner circle, people of immense influence in his court, and likely his friends. As I've been saying, we know Messmer wasn't an aloof lord. He had close relationships with his closest allies, like R'hllana, like Gaius, and like these Fire Knights. Additionally, we know that he valued members of his Black Knights as well, specifically Captain Hugh. Hugh was the son of Black Knight Commander Andreas, and his ashes tell us that he joined his father in rebellion against Messmer. But as a result, Messmer mourned the loss of a comrade in arms. He mourned the death of this Hugh. The fact he would have camaraderie with a Black Knight who wasn't even a part of his inner circle tells us a lot about Messmer's character. R'hllana, Andreas, Gaius, the Fire Knights, they all made a choice to follow Messmer into this crusade, despite knowing what it would cost them in regards to their standing in the lands between. Let us talk about the Black Knights and Messmer soldiers, since we are essentially doing a full breakdown of all of those who followed Messmer. Unlike the inner circle of Messmer who wear the red of their lord, the bulk of his armies actually wear black etched with gold. Both the description of the knight armor set and the Messmer soldier set essentially say the same thing. The armor is black with only a touch of gold, the gold of the Erdtree sigil, and this little bit of gold was meant to offer them solace in their duty, in the perpetration of a war without honour or grace. I take this to mean that the black of their uniform is reflective of their grim duty and purpose. They are here as executioners. This is not a glorious war to be sung about in years to come. It is brutal, it is slaughter. Unlike the fiercely loyal Fire Knights, the lower soldiery of Messmer's army aren't all here out of choice. The face masks of Messmer's soldiers read the following: "A small consolation to those forced to wage a war without grace or honour." The fact they are forced to be here makes more sense if we read the Messmer soldier ashes, as they elaborate on this detail. They read the following: "These soldiers belong to the ignoble penal battalion, and were buried hidden from the Erdtree's sight." A penal battalion, meaning the soldiers of Messmer's army are ex-convicts, hence they were made to fight this war. For Marika, this is a win-win. If she is planning to get rid of Messmer and seal him in these lands anyway, then why not empty your jails while you're at it? Additionally, given the distasteful nature of this crusade, aside from the zealous few and those really loyal to Messmer, I don't imagine you'd get a lot of warriors volunteering for this crusade, and as such, the ranks were filled with the unwilling. But what about the Black Knights? We know from Andreas's Ash that these warriors made up the majority of Messmer's forces. They were the bread and butter and backbone of his fighting force, and clearly Messmer took some time out of his day to interact with some of them like you, and those like Andreas were indeed loyal. Yet the Knight set also says that these warriors were forced to fight in this war, similar to the regular soldiers. So what's the deal here? Were they also prisoners? Unlike the Fire Knights and the Messmer soldiers, we do not know what category of society these knights came from. Now, the simple explanation could be that they were already part of Messmer's fighting force, and they were just forced to go along with this as part of his commands. Yet there's another possible, more interesting explanation. Andreas's and Hugh's ashes tell us that they had command over the powers of the Crucible, and indeed, other Black Knights also have an association with the Crucible. Sub-bosses like Black Knight Edred also summon the powers of the Crucible, in his case manifesting as wings. Now, admittedly, the basic Black Knights we face in great numbers do not seem to use Crucible powers. But what if in general these knights are somehow associated with the Crucible? Not exactly Crucible knights, but warriors and practitioners linked to Crucible powers. If true, their place in the capital could be tenuous, and thus perhaps any Crucible-esque warrior was pushed into becoming a Black Knight. So again, this would be a win-win for Leyndell, getting rid of their prisoners and any other associations with the Crucible in one fell swoop. It's just a fun theory, of course, but it would explain why the Black Knights seem to have some loose connection to the Crucible. Whatever their reasons for being here, whether they were forced or they were part of Messmer's army already, they certainly are stalwart in their duty. For example, the Black Knight shield reads the following: "Symbolic of their iron conviction in their crusade, the Black Knights will never yield, nor will they ever doubt their purpose." These knights are not like the conscripted prisoners of the lower ranks. They are men of conviction, and it shows in their fearsome combat prowess and their stoic nature in dishing out this brutal slaughter. They are unyielding in their loyalty to their lord, and unwavering in the prosecution of their duty, no matter how grim that might be. The Black Knight shield says, "Nor will they ever doubt their purpose," and this is clearly how these knights operated when they were perpetrating their slaughter against an entire people. They just got the head down and did the job in front of them. However, the Black Knight helm that we looked at earlier very much hints that despite this, it'll have no doubt weighed heavily at them in the deepest recesses of their psyche. Finally, of course, we have the Furnace Golems, the final constituent part of Messmer's crusade. These are fearsome instruments of war that assisted in burning the lands of the Hornsent and the Hornsent themselves. We do get some information about these monstrosities, starting with the Furnace Visage, which reads the following. A stone mask surrounded by curled horns, depicting the fell god of fire that haunts the sagas of the Hornsent. So the fell god of fire of the Hornsent sagas suggests that this is a god of their mythology and culture, one that scared them, that haunted them. However, given it is the fell god of fire, it makes it almost certain that this is the same fell god that is associated with the fire giants, but it's just interpreted and portrayed in a different way from a separate culture. This likelihood is compounded by the fact that there are fire giant effigies found on the legs of these furnace golems. As I've pointed out in my past 2 videos, and I swear this is the last time I'll make this point, the Erdtree culture has a history of portraying the fire giants on weapons of fire, such as the cultural impact that the fire giants had on Leyndell. As such, Messmer's forces carry on this tradition by putting the fire giants on this new weapon of fire, alongside the fell god which is feared by the Hornsent. And this is a scare tactic, and it isn't something new for Erdtree culture either. The Omen Smirk mask of the Omen Killers is said to portray a spirit which haunts the Omen in their dreams, and again is another brutal scare tactic for those they hunt. To add to the horror, these furnace golems are actually animated, even in their faces. The faceplate of the furnace golem is usually stoic, and you would be forgiven for thinking it's just a still carving. However, if you knock them down and hurt them, they open their mouths in fear or despair, and one can only imagine how horrifying these would have been to face for the Hornsent. These monsters are probably being animated by the magic of Messmer's Flame. We've already discussed when looking at Wago how Messmer's Flame has some interesting uses, how he was able to use it to resurrect the dead, no doubt a side effect of the power of dark that's within Messmer's Flame, and so why couldn't it be used to animate these golems? We know it's Messmer's Flame that is within them rather than just regular flame, because we can make a smaller version of these furnaces in the hefty furnace pot, and one of its ingredients include Messmer's embers. Additionally, part of the furnace golem's ingredients is Erdtree sap, something we can learn of by reading any of the new tears which are dropped by the furnace golems, and they read the following. A crystal tear forms slowly over the ages, where the scattered sap of the Erdtree pools deep within the furnace golems. The combination of Messmer's dark flame and the dark tainted sap of the Erdtree had a rather sinister effect, as the hefty furnace pot reads the following. The furnace's flame burns away both body and soul. When impurity is thus expunged, one calls it cleansing. We looked deeply at the dark and the abyss in the prior chapters, and therefore the furnace golems having the power of the dark within them, both in the form of the Erdtree sap and Messmer's Flame, should be significant to you. The fires that burn within the furnace golems are not normal, fueled by the Erdtree and the abyssal touch flame of Messmer. Even the souls of those who are burned are also destroyed. This was meant to be a thorough cleansing, and so Messmer unleashed his flame, his spears, his men, and his furnace golems upon the land, an apocalyptic event that we see unfold in the story trailer. The finale of which seemed to be the impaling of the divine beasts, the pinnacle of Hornsent culture, and the best of their horned warriors. There are only 2 divine beasts left by the time we arrive in the Lands of Shadow, the one at Bellerat, and one found in the ancient ruins of Ra. And we learn why there's so few of these divine beasts left, thanks to Divine Beast Tornado, which reads, the majority of divine beasts were gored and hung upon Messmer's spears, then burned in his flame. Those who witnessed the deed likened it to a funeral pyre for the tower itself. Messmer's crusade was thorough, and it wasn't just Bellerat that was destroyed, it was the other towns of the Hornsent that exist within the Lands of Shadow. All that remains of the Hornsent culture is a few survivors, and the specimens that are strung up in the Black Keep. The rest were impaled upon Messmer's iconic spear. And before we move on, I do want to talk about Messmer's iconic weapon, because there's one detail that I really like. Messmer is able to throw his spear and recall it to his hand at will. He's also able to make copies of it, and again it reappears in his hand. And this is like the Smith script weapons that we can find in the Lands of Shadow, and there is a reason this is the case. It's because it's made the same way. The item description for the Spear of the Impaler reads the following: remade by the forging arts of the Realm of Shadow, meaning it was made here in the Lands of Shadow using the ancient smith script techniques of the forges. Whether he made this during his crusade or prior to it when there was peace here is up for debate, but it's certainly ironic that Messmer is using the ancient arts of these lands to slaughter its people. And yet, despite the total destruction of these people and the Crusade essentially achieving its goals, Messmer and the Crusaders are still here to this day. In fact, Messmer even has a throne that mirrors the one of the Elden Lord in Leyndell, showing that he is essentially settled here as the Lord of the Lands of Shadow. This isn't a temporary crusade anymore. These lands are his home and domain. We've mentioned this a few times now, but the reason that Messmer is still here is because his mother has sealed him here. Marika wanted Messmer to be sealed in these lands, and he is not remaining here by choice. He, the Abyssal Serpent, and the Original Sin are all safely tucked away from Leyndell in the Lands of Grace. There is evidence that the Crusaders were unexpectedly trapped here, via two ghost dialogues that we get. The first is found in Castle Ensis, where a soldier is begging Queen Marika to reach out to her son, Messmer, so the crusade could end. Then there is the ghost of a Black Knight in the Black Keep, who laments and is in denial. Surely Queen Marika would not abandon them there, as Messmer is her own son. The Crusaders likely expected to come on this holy war and then be allowed to return home. And I suspect that this frustration at Marika's abandonment is the reason that every statue of Queen Marika in the Lands of Shadow are defaced, including ones in the Black Keep. This could only be done by Messmer's soldiers. No Hornsent have access to this keep. I think it's frustration at the fact they have been abandoned. The only one that actually has its head intact is the one in Messmer's room, and this is because of the love and loyalty that Messmer still has for his mother. One thing we do need to discuss is the actual mechanics of how Messmer was sealed here. This is something I talked about in my Shroud chapter of my Story Explained video, however it is still relevant to Messmer and my ideas have evolved slightly since then, so I want to discuss it here. We know from pre-DLC interviews with Miyazaki that the Lands of Shadows are physically disconnected from the Lands Between, meaning they did used to be attached to the rest of the Lands Between, but they have now become disconnected somehow. And we know from the flavor text of the DLC that's on the Bandai Namco website, etc., that these lands are obscured by the Erdtree. And having talked about the relevance of Shadow and the Skadu Tree, we can definitely see how this is possible mechanically. The power of Shadow and the Dark does have the power to obscure, just like the Sealing Tree was used to hide and obscure the Tower of Shadow. The story trailer tells us that Gold and Shadow were born at the same time. I take this to mean that the moment that Marika became a god, her system of dualities came into being. With the Erdtree came the Skadu Tree. With Gold came Shadow. And so my initial thought was that at the same moment that the Skadu Tree was born, these lands would have been shrouded and removed, as that does cosmically make sense. However, there are some issues here if we accept that as the reality. We know that it is extremely difficult to travel to the Lands of Shadow when it's behind the veil. Miquella, one of the most powerful beings of this era, needs to jump through a lot of hoops in order to gain access to this realm. He has to bewitch Mohg into defiling his body, removing its grace with his tainted omen blood. If Miquella has such problems reaching the Lands of Shadow, then how can we explain Messmer coming here with a huge army? Well, of course, we could just explain it away to Queen Marika having powers that allowed their transportation here. At the end of the day, she is the vessel of the Elden Ring, and the god of this system of Gold and Shadow. Surely she would have the powers to transport people across the veil. Then we could explain Messmer's sealing as her just leaving them here and not bringing them back. However, some might not find this explanation satisfying, and I'm starting not to, so let us consider the other side of the argument. That the Lands of Shadow were not immediately obscured when the Skadu Tree came into existence, and in fact, the Lands of Shadow and the Lands of Leyndell lay alongside one another for a period of time. This would definitely explain a lot of things. And there's one particular character in general that makes me think that this is the most likely explanation. Crucible Knight Devonia. She is found in the ruins of Ra, and her helmet reads the following. It is said Devonia quested in search of the Crucible's origin, and departed from the lands of the Erdtree alone. How would Devonia have been able to travel here from the lands of the Erdtree if the Lands of Shadow had been veiled from the beginning? And the answer is, she couldn't. Is it not far more likely that the Lands of Shadow were not initially veiled, and she was able to walk here from the lands of Leyndell, in a period after she had served Lord Godfrey, and in that period as described by the Crucible Knight gauntlets, where the Crucible Knights began to become disdained? Would this not be the most likely moment where she would travel from Leyndell and go to the Lands of Shadow? To sum up, her presence is easier to understand if the Lands of Shadow were once attached to Leyndell and she simply travelled here normally. Additionally, if Leyndell and Ballarat once existed alongside each other in a period of peace, it could also explain some other certain cultural overlaps. We've discussed already how the Crusade clearly took place later on in the timeline, and this must mean that Ballarat was allowed to exist. Indeed, the item description of Festive Greece implies as much, as it reads, "The delightful festival is an old tradition, one old enough for the Erdtree to tacitly tolerate its endurance." This highly suggests that the people of Hornsent and the Lands of Shadow were under the rule of the Erdtree for some time, and for a period of time they were able to carry on their old traditions. Indeed, this cultural overlap is further emphasised by the dueling shield, which reads the following: "An armament once used in ritual combat performed to honour the Erdtree, a custom that had somehow remained within the realm of Shadow." To me, it seems highly unlikely that this cultural import, ritual and arena combat, could be transferred from Leyndell to Ballarat if they were separated by a veil from the very beginning of the Erdtree's reign. Finally, another thing to consider is the veil that we see in the sky. I first saw this idea suggested by Sekiro Dubi, but I know a lot of people have said it, that the veil very much is a reflection of the canopy that is in Marika's bedchamber in Leyndell. The imagery is quite clear. This veil that hangs over the Lands of Shadow is clearly the literal veil that obscures it from the rest of the lands between. And given it has an oblique tie to Marika, it implies that she actively put this shroud in place, rather than it being a natural consequence of the Erdtree and Shadowtree's creation. This narrative would suggest, therefore, that Messmer and his armies marched on Ballarat from Leyndell as normal, and as soon as they crossed the border into the realm of Shadow, Marika placed a veil over the land, sealing Messmer and his army in there forever. I think this is where I stand currently on the issue of the shroud. I think Devonia's presence is a big one for me, but again, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Whatever the mechanism by which Messmer was sealed in the Lands of Shadow, I believe that Marika's true goal with the crusade that she wanted Messmer to undertake wasn't really the destruction of the Hornsent. That is just a byproduct of it. She wanted to have her son sealed away somewhere. She saw the darkness within him and wanted him removed from the lands of grace. Additionally, it would also allow her original sin, her betrayal and ascension to godhood, to be hidden as well. We looked at the power of dark at the first part of this video, and now understanding its power and opposition to light and grace, it does somewhat make sense that Marika would want this influence removed. Messmer still holds true to his mother, or at least is trying to. As I said, the one statue of Marika that is not beheaded in the Lands of Shadow is the one in his chamber, a statue of Marika cradling her child. Given it's in his throne room, we can only conclude that this is a statue depicting Marika with Messmer, a tender moment that Messmer clearly still holds dear. Messmer's relationship with his mother is clearly complex, and in many ways it's one of the most important parts of his identity. He did all of this for his mother, becoming a reviled symbol of fear, staining his hands with blood, and taking the public flak for it, while she could remain squeaky clean, somewhat. Even at the end, when he is challenged by her lord, a graceless tarnish no less, he begs for her forgiveness when he unleashes the Abyssal Serpent within him. It's only finally, at the end of it all, at the moment of his death, that he finally curses his mother.
Mother. Marika, a curse upon thee.
And who can blame him? Messmer stayed true to the mission his mother gave him, committing horrible crimes, mass murder, and still holding true to her even after she abandoned him there for God knows how long. And it's only at the moment of his death, when he is struck down by Marika's Lord-elect, that he curses her, realising it was all for nothing, it was a facade. He stained his soul killing the Graceless for his mother, truly believing in the cause, only for a Graceless tarnish to be chosen by Marika and kill him. Such is the story of Messmer, the abandoned and forgotten child of Marika. I'm hesitant to call it tragic, because whether or not he was reluctant to do these things, he did still undertake these brutal acts of murder. But as with all Elden Ring characters, there is nuance to him. He is the brutal impaler, but he is also the abandoned son, afflicted with a monster within him from birth. Both of these things can be true at once, and it's the result of the masterful writing by J.R.R. Martin and Miyazaki, and it helps round out the roster of Demi-God children very well, and helps complete the story of Elden Ring. So that is my take on Messmer the Impaler, a fascinating character that fills a unique role within the Elden Ring pantheon. What are your thoughts on Messmer? Please let me know in the comments below, especially if you disagree with some of my takes or you think I've missed something. But until next time guys, I will see you in the lands of shadow. Take care and have a wonderful evening.